Welcome, Barbara Dyskant, to the People's Voice Cafe interview series, or as I like to call it, PVC NYC TV. I'm Chris Old Owens, and it is my pleasure and honor to interview you today for your upcoming show here at People's Voice Cafe on October 7th. That's going to be a fun show. And ironically enough, I personally will not be present. I'll be watching from the live stream, which everybody should know we live stream as well as have in person. But I'm also hoping that you and I will be able to get together a couple of days later and do some music on our own so we can share that experience and we can talk about the show. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this. And let me start by asking you, where were you born? Where were you raised? How did you get involved with music?
Well, I was born in Doctors Hospital in Washington Heights. My parents lived on West 181st Street. And that's where we used to walk to Fort Tryon Park and watch the squirrels. That's my earliest memories of growing up and of starting out. So that's where Barbara began. And at least Barbara, for which I know of her. And I was raised in a family of second generation. Actually, my father came here from Poland when he was 3 years old. So I, de facto, born here. And my mother was the one of 8 children, and she was born, although her 3 oldest siblings were born in the old country, which was Latvia. Grandma arrived and had the rest of them here. So she was, that's how I was grown up. And from what I can understand, I was singing and making up songs and making up whatever, probably before I could talk. It just was something that was wired into me. When I meet people, sometimes little melodies come to me that I associate with that person, or sometimes little songs or just experiences. It's just who I always think I've been.
I hear that from several folks, that they either were told or they kind of remember that expressing themselves in a musical fashion was the earliest and most natural thing for them to do.
It was, and it didn't run really in my family. My father was a storyteller not by trade, but by passion. But and he did some singing. He sang some Burl Ives, and I used to back him up on the piano, and we had a great time with it. However, I was the first one. I don't know if they knew what to do with me because I really was just so into it. And I got a little bit discouraged. I did not get encouraged to pursue it. It was something to be done as a hobby, but weird people do music. If you could do, or if there's anything else in the world you could do that rather than the music as a serious thing. So,
were you supposed to go out and find a good husband?
Probably. And I remember when my parents were immigrants, and I guess they wanted to fit in and wanted me to whatever. And I remember when I was in college, I dated a man once, and I really wasn't that interested in him, but he came from a very wealthy neighborhood. And my mother kept telling me, well, what's wrong with him? What's wrong with him? And it's like, well, I don't enjoy being with him. But it's like, what's wrong? He can't be that bad if he's Jewish and rich. So I'm laughing at it now, but I felt like I really didn't want to be bought and sold even then. And my mother I could realize that was from her having been from a family where to raise oneself had to be done. I feel like I can understand more where she was coming from, although I have to admit the fur flew at the time.
Sure, I can imagine. Absolutely. My mother was a bit of a rebel in that regard too. She had no interest in spending her time preparing to be married to somebody. She had her dreams of music and doing the stuff she wanted to do. So I hear you loud and clear. Let me ask you one quick question before we move away from childhood. You were near Fort Tryon Park, so the cloisters are there. Were they there yet when you were growing up?
And that was the other place we used to go off. We could walk to it, and that was a place, to me, that was just where you went. Until my parents moved when I was 4, it was a white flight thing that they were very open about, and we moved to the suburbs. And I still remember moving day, moving from Washington Heights, which I loved, to the suburbs, which I did not love. And I could feel it then. I still feel like Washington Heights was home, even though I was only there for 4 or 5 years.
Interesting. So I want to talk a little bit more about the cloisters. So when you went to the cloisters, for me, my mother took me to the cloisters early, and of course we came from Brooklyn, so we didn't come as often as you went. But for me, the big thing was the unicorn tapestries.
Oh yes, exactly.
That was my inspiration. I even got into an argument with my kindergarten teacher about the existence of unicorns because I had seen one, in the tapestry. So I was wondering, how did the art and the setting of the cloisters, impress itself upon you?
The unicorn tapestries were one of them. And the other is those walled gardens. I used to like to sit on the wall on the wall of the gardens and just sort of look around. And even after we moved out, my father and I still would go to the cloisters, even though we had to go all the way from Queens. We still went. I grew up starting there and then kept going even through my teens. And some of my fondest memories, but that's interesting. I mean, like 4 or 5 tapestries, and I remember the one with the unicorn being, I wouldn't say caged, the corralled at the end.
Yes.
Do you
Yes.
remember that?
Yes. That was very sad, when they pierce it and then they put it in the corral. It was vivid for me.
That's very interesting because that's exactly when you said the unicorn, that's the first thing I would have said too.
Interesting. So now you said you moved to the suburbs, but then you said you lived in Queens. So was Queens the suburbs for you?
At that time it was. We were out in Bayside, and it really was. We couldn't afford a house. We still lived in a part. That's what was funny. We didn't move upward economically. I still lived on a 5th floor of an apartment complex that was very uniform. It just, me being in a family that, we couldn't afford a house, but we always went to the theater and we went to the symphony and we did that kind of thing. That was considered a priority.
So basically, even though your parents didn't encourage you individually to pursue music, they were very much into culture and sharing that as a family.
Absolutely. We went to Tanglewood in the summer,
Wow.
and the way, we'd watch this. To me, it was just second nature. A friend had a cabin there and we used to go because I was studying classical piano at the time, and my mother became friends with one of the other parents and they used to invite us to go up. So we'd,
Literal play date.
Oh, it was a literal play date.
Have a play date.
Oh, we had such a good time at that. And I still remember sitting in the picnic area and just taking in all the music and just being in love.
Now, did you have a piano in your house?
Not until I was 9. My mother did not want me to start lessons until I was a little older. I don't know why, but she just somehow didn't, maybe she didn't think it would stick. I wanted a piano from the time I was 2 maybe or 3. The first time I laid eyes on a piano, probably that was my instrument and I knew it. I still remember when the piano arrived and I was in the hall shrieking. As anyone came in the door. If this was an apartment building with a zillion apartments and I was standing in the hall shrieking.
Wow. Did anyone else in the family even attempt to play the piano, or was it just you?
There was a little bit of fooling with the piano, but basically it was me. I have to say she encouraged me in spite, because I had a teacher who was a Juilliard piano student, and he wanted me to apply to the Juilliard preparatory division. And my mother took me there. I got in, and she used to every week she'd drive me to Harlem, and which terrified her at the time, but she'd drive all the way down 125th Street. I was fascinated meeting with Harlem. If I could have gotten in the car and just out of the car and walked around, I would have loved to. But the fact was they took all that energy into spending all day Saturday taking me to Juilliard, where I learned theory, and also used to sneak into the piano practice rooms and practice rock and roll, because I was very much in love with Elvis Presley. And, and I didn't see any reason not to play that too, but I couldn't do that in the open at those times. So
it was called hiding all that whole lot of shaking that was going on, right?
Okay. And I used to keep a radio under my covers and listen to Symphony Sid, which I don't know if you ever heard him.
I did.
And I used to sneak when my parents thought I was asleep. Now I'm not sure. Maybe they just wanted to go along with the game, but I hide, it was bedtime and I'd have my transistor radio hidden under the covers and talk about Symphony Sid in the city. I said I'd listen to that with great glee until I probably really late. I had this thing. I loved Mozart. I still play Mozart. I adore Mozart. And I also enjoyed Symphony Sid and rock and roll. And Elvis Presley was just my absolute hero. I was 8 years old at the time.
I totally get that. I wanted a transistor radio more than anything when I was 10 years old, and I got one over my mother's serious objections, and I hid it under my pillow, and I would listen to it at night, just like you. And I was raised on classical music. My mother was my piano teacher. My favorite, I will admit, is Beethoven, not Mozart. He's number 3, Beethoven, Bach, and Mozart for me. But the bottom line is I was never a big fan of practicing, so I wasn't somebody who was going to go become a classical pianist, and follow it as seriously as you did. But I listened to that radio, and then in middle school, I fell in love with Elton John. And that's what took me off of all piano lessons. And that's when I started playing by ear rock and roll piano, because everything he did was a 4/1 piano progression. And so it was real easy to learn his songs, and I had a good ear. And my mother was going crazy, but I was still playing other instruments, so she couldn't complain too much.
My father used to call Elvis Presley that long-haired galoot. And she was telling me, "Well, you're listening to that long-haired galoot." The story.
Wow.
It was almost like he thought I was dating him or something, which I would have loved, but never mind that.
So you studied theory, you were seriously doing classical piano, and you got to high school. Where'd you go to high school?
Forest Hills High.
Was you Forest Hills? Oh, did they have a good music program then? I know they did later on.
Not much, although Simon and Garfunkel used to practice in the bell tower.
Did you hear them practicing?
No, they were a few years ahead of me. They were older than I was. I just looked up to them. There wasn't much of a music program there at all when I was there. And I also was really into other subjects. I liked math. I liked history. I had a lot of trouble with the way history was taught because it just felt fishy to me. That's the only way I could describe it. When I was told that the reason we got the Gadsden Purchase was manifest destiny, and it even probably came up on an exam.
Oh, of course. It was a multiple choice question. What was the reason why manifest destiny, choice number C?
So I started writing parodies on she's a grand old flag, and I was writing parodies on it to myself. I never sang them to anyone, and I forgot what they were, but I just got so sick of it. That was my way of dealing with it.
That's very clever. I like that a lot. Very, very good. So you didn't take Howard Zinn's history and turn it into a series of songs yet?
No, but I did hear Howard Zinn. It was one of the fondest memories of my life. Was a long time later. It was probably, Nadine was two, so it was probably 30 years ago. I did get to hear him live on do a lecture, and he was, I don't know if you've ever heard him.
I never heard him live, no.
Incredible sense of humor, just a delightful opening person, just a person who was just, again, a hero, when I talk about, and his autobiography, You Can't Remain Neutral on a Moving Train, so I was interested in other things which delighted my parents, and I was discouraged from going on to the college division at Juilliard, although I kept composing, and Columbia didn't have a bad music department. So I took enough credits to technically major in music anyway, and my basic thing with music is I'd sit at the piano. I knew the theory, I knew all that, but I'd sit at the piano, watch my hands, and see where they went. And that was sort of the way the one thing I most loved about music was improvising, start on Mozart and then do my own improvisation on him. And I like that. Improvising on Mozart, the improviser. I like that. You'd start off playing him straight, and then you'd go somewhere. And you yourself wouldn't know where it would go, but it would be a heck of a lot of fun. Chopin is another one that I really enjoy, and Bartok. Bartok's Six Dances in Bulgaria got me into polyrhythms.
When you finished high school, where did you end up?
Actually, I got a scholarship to go to Smith College, which at the time is not the way it is now. Now it's a really wonderful place. At the time, President Nixon's daughter went there. I mean, it was too rich for my blood, and my best memory of there was I just didn't fit in. I wasn't a debutante. I got to meet them, but I wasn't one of them. And my favorite memory was taking my bicycle and riding as far out into the country and meeting the townies and getting to meet everybody else. So I transferred after a year, ended up at Barnard, which wasn't great, but at least I had there was more life. And I didn't like being in a girls' school, not because I didn't like being a woman, but I didn't want the only time you met men to be when you were dating them. That
Right.
just didn't feel good to me. And that's what it was. We were supposed to be bought and sold to some aspiring politician or whatever. And it wasn't me. And gracious living and having to wear a skirt to the dining room every day didn't cut it. I understand now it's become a very, very different place, but it wasn't that way then.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it was a totally different time. Absolutely. I have a niece at Smith now, and you would not believe the way Smith is different from the way it was.
Oh, I know. I've been there. I went and visited. I have friends in Northampton.
Oh, okay. You finished college, and what were you doing?
I majored in economics, which I just enjoyed the idea of using science and humanities to help humanity. And you will love this, Chris. I studied international economics, and with the aim of joining the Agency for International Development and helping these poor countries achieve economic takeoff. I was passionate about the 7 stages of growth until I took a course in Marxist economics with Professor Ehrlich.
Oh,
And it's like,
blew your
and,
mind.
and I was I was taking electronic music with Professor Otto Mooning, who I loved. And you did no synthesizers, you couldn't use them. You had 9 Ampexes in sync. You had a sine wave generator, a square wave generator, something that looked like a Scotch tape dispenser so you could cut your pieces out and splice them together.
Yeah, sure.
Track was short. That's what you did. But you could get to use the whole lab if you went into the lab at 2 a.m. And that was in Harlem, out on 122nd or 3rd Street. I got off at the wrong floor, and there were all these guards around. And I think I ended up at the secret research place that they were rumored to exist.
Ooh.
And I got out of there fast, but I had taken that class with Professor Ehrlich, and and then 1968 came with the student rebellion, and there I was. And well, suffice to say, I never went to work for the Agency for International Development.
Yeah, I can imagine. Tell us a little bit more about the Student Rebellion. Were you involved with any of this stuff directly?
I wasn't directly involved. I went to a few meetings and it seemed like people were really cliquey, and I liked what was being talked about, but I didn't feel comfortable. And I went to the marches and did that, but I never did the heavy stuff. Maybe I would if people had been more inclusive, but I still felt there was sort of I don't know what it was. And just maybe my own insecurity. I'm not trying to put anyone down.
No, I understand. But isn't it interesting how on one hand at Smith, there's a level of clickiness and exclusivity that comes with that social setting. And yet on the other hand, far to the left, there's a level of clickiness and exclusivity. It happens all over. It's part of the human condition for us that we tend to get into our little things and look at other people with distrust. And the only way we're going to change the world is if we overcome all that crap.
I know. And I just, by then I had gotten out of the Agency for International Development thing. And you'll have to laugh because my thesis before I did that was on how the Philippines were impeding their economic prosperity by being too attached and friendly with each other, and that they had too many personal ties to allow themselves to develop.
Wow.
So that was my thesis until
Oh my God.
I still felt there was a lot wrong with this country, in terms of the civil rights movement. I really wanted to go join the civil rights movement when I was in high school. No way I could have gotten away with that with my family. I'm so envious of people who, I don't know whether you were, who were red diaper babies, who were just.
My mother was in spirit, but I wouldn't call myself one in the same tradition as other folks that I know.
Yeah, with me, it was like, look at it, isn't that nice? But when I wanted to bring a Black friend home, my mother didn't say what she said is, you have nothing in common. It was like the sort of the nicey nice way of, and I actually wrote a song about it, which I'm probably going to do with the show. both how that hurt me and how I'm aware it probably hurt her worse than it hurt me, and being concerned for who she is now and where she is, and I hope she's okay. That this must have been one among many. But at the time, I was an oddball, as was obvious. I was a young musician at a time of not, the Bob Hope era. And at the same time, here I was with this one friend that I'd found who I just adored. And another time I was told, oh, you can hang out with this girl from Cuba, but don't go ice skating with her. So all of this rankled on me till the present. So I wasn't like all sold on the American ideal, but I still somehow didn't get what the Agency for International Development and Imperialism was. That did not, and I was being groomed to become one of them.
Sure, sure, no, absolutely, and you were not alone. So during this time, also there was this explosion in folk music and anti-war music and all kinds of stuff. Where were you in this collection of things that were going on?
Oh, I wanted to sing it, and I did a couple of open mics and felt like I screwed up and got myself discouraged. And I kept writing songs. But in fact, one of the things I'm going to present at the show is the whole thing of putting off your dreams, because I feel like I'm starting now, as a white-haired lady, where people have started in their 20s, and yet I've written hundreds of songs, but I somehow, like one little setback got me. And having gone beyond that, but I listened to, oh gosh, I knew every word of Joan Baez's first albums, every single word I know. I still remember every word of Harry Belafonte, who was my first role model, who I used to listen to. And interestingly enough, there was one of his songs that wasn't well known that struck me the most. Do you remember Brown Skin Girl?
I do not remember well enough to recall the lyrics.
It was essentially about the oppression of Black women by white men.
Right.
And that's what he was singing about. Brown skin girl, come home and mine, baby. I'm going away in a sailing boat, and if I don't come back, stay home and mind the baby. I mean, that can't be as more showing what the oppression is, and that just struck me to the core. So I would think that he probably gave me the first inkling through his music of where I would be going 20 and 30 years later.
Somewhere along the line, you got married and had kids and did all kinds of stuff.
I did. Well, the first one was the only thing I did right was not to have kids with this particular person. It's like, I'm so pleased that my daughter has grown up with a beautiful sense of herself, and she would never let herself do that. She's just started a relationship with an absolutely lovely guy who respects her fully and who she respects. So that's wherever it goes, she's not falling into it. And it's like, I don't want to pass that. However, I did marry again and had two lovely boys, and the relationship did end. It wasn't a good one, although he did the honorable. And then a few years later, and that was the time I realized my dream after we separated. I wanted to live in the country. And after we separated, we were in San Francisco. I hauled off with the two boys and moved into a one-room cabin down a 4-mile dirt road in the Sierra foothills with the boys and went, we're starting over, which I did. And then 3 years later, I met Barry, who had been, I had been an activist quite a while, although I had taken a break from it in terms of just having to raise two boys. And when I met Barry, he was involved with standing on the tracks at Concord Naval Weapons Station and had found Nuremberg actions, having been an Air Force vet, and asked me what I thought of it. And I said, well, I'm awed by it. And we courted and we dated and we had lovely conversations and got married eventually, and we're together over 30 years before he passed, before I lost him a little over 3 years ago. We did a lot of work together and not together, which I liked. And we moved to Livermore, and I got involved. And that was when I got involved with political work again. I was sitting.
Just for our audience, Livermore is where?
It's where nuclear weapons are designed. And it's in Livermore, California, 60 miles east of San Francisco. And ironically, he was managing a wind farm, but it was right near Livermore. And I read in the paper that they were going to declassify radioactive waste and recycle it into consumer goods. And it was like this ding went off in my head, sort of, Barbara, you're going back to activism. You are going to work on this. Well, anyway, I sunk myself in. We were had to write some legal material. I learned how to write it and ended up getting sent to a press workshop by the group I was with, Tri-Valley Cares. And then they sent me and Barry to Highlander to train for grassroots organization, which I thought was the most incredible. It's like, you want to send us? And Nadine at 1.5 was the youngest person participating. She became their mascot of the workshop.
Hey, and the children shall lead us.
One of my other songs is about that, you better clean it up. I told my kids to clean up your room. They said, why don't you clean your room? And, they catch me in everything I did. And it's what I taught them to do, and I had to live with the consequences.
Sure, of course.
A few times. But at any rate, that was how I got back into activism but I also loved living in the country from having been in the foothills. It's a whole different life. And as I think I've lived but one of the things we did with the Lawrence Livermore Lab was they were lying all the time. There was a tree that was transpiring tritium, and we wrote a letter to the paper, and they denied it. They denied the plutonium in the playground too. And finally, I wrote a letter to the paper. It was my turn to write from Ken. They said the newspaper said, we can't print this. I said, why? They said the lab denied it. Mm-hmm. So we got to one up them. It's like, well, as a matter of fact, the material came from the lab's own papers, and furthermore, it's sitting on your desk. Would you like to read it? And so it just happened. It was a good coincidence. We didn't always nail it, but we did that time. And ever since then, they listened to us.
Well, they knew you weren't just making stuff up.
But they were ready to accuse us of making stuff.
Sure.
They didn't ask the lab to prove it. They asked the burden of proof was on us.
Sure.
It's always been on us. So that was, that's what we did. And then, Barry's job took us to Western New York State. And again, we had a choice between New York City and Western New York State. He was a whistleblower with his company, and he got laid off. We went, so be it. And he was from a small town in Iowa and was not at all familiar with cities. And to the day he passed, he couldn't understand. And I tried to explain to him why anyone would live in one.
And here we are, New Yorkers, trying to explain to people why we can't live in the country.
Well, I've done both.
Yes, you've done both. I can't.
I lived in Brooklyn, and yet I love living out here. I originally started as leaving the world after a divorce, but I just fell in love with it. It's different. It's very, very, it's a whole, when we talk about the difference, we're interrelated, but it's like I'm very much involved with both because I love both. I don't like the suburbs, but I like the inner city, and I like being way out there. It's a different kind of community, and yet the person who loves Trump, who lives across the way, didn't hesitate to pull me out of a snowdrift. We know who each other are, but if someone's stuck in a snowdrift, we're there, because we're both having to deal with that. There's no fire department within who knows how far. It's sort of a different kind of coexistence. I started a local contra dance here because I don't know whether I've mentioned I'm a dance musician too. I play with
No, you hadn't mentioned that. That's awesome.
My daughter and I play together. We are Confluence, which is a contra dance band that tours.
So tell us more about the music. I mean, you say you've written hundreds of songs. You've been playing the piano throughout your life. So where are you now? You've also mentioned that you're kind of starting again, which I totally can identify with, because after my wife passed and my kids were older and essentially out of the house, it was kind of like, okay, time to reconnect to the music I put aside when I started a family. So what's going on with you now? Where are you in your process, and what do you see happening in the future?
Well, I'm still going to play dance music, and I play dance music even when I do a progressive concert, because I still feel like we have to fight and we have to celebrate life, and we need to be able to do both. So I try to include, but I don't think we could do either well without the other. And it doesn't have to be dance, but some form of celebration. I truly believe in my heart if you don't know how to do either of them, you're selling the other part of it short. You're not being whole. And so when I'm going to play dance music at the concert. I think you've heard the one I do, Find Yourself with the Music. And I'm
Oh, yes.
going to do a few other ones. And at the same time, also sing rather heavy ones. I have one about, aid terrorism if they do it in our name, which is definitely not a dance tune. It's a blues. It's a blues tune. And some more serious ones I don't know if what about my husband's passing, which I don't know if you've been in any of the workshops I sang that at. And one about Nadine, my daughter's a leukemia survivor. And one about the woman who I knew who also lost her daughter, and her daughter told her right before she died, her teenage daughter said, if you've learned anything from this, do something about it and make a difference. And she did. She started a support network for teens with cancer and did an amazing, just helped us and everyone else. So one of my songs is essentially about two mothers and two daughters, about Lauren and her daughter and me and my daughter and leukemia and what happens. So I guess in my life, I like to include all of it. So when you're asking where I'm going musically, when I started singing progressive songs, that's all I did. I felt like I was being a sledgehammer. And people reacted like they were being hit by a sledgehammer.
Well, really, you tap into something very important as we artists approach this, because each of us has a different way of doing things. And, each of us has a different way of telling stories. Some of us don't even tell stories as much. I'm not as much of a storyteller. I admire those who are great storytellers to make their points. I think they're wonderful. I tend to be more of a sledgehammer, a little bit more preachy in a lot of my music, and I've worked really hard to try and pull back on that a bit. But at the same time, sometimes there's no other way to say it.
You're absolutely right, and I will include sledgehammer songs in there. And I find it hard because I still have this thing about me. I don't want to make people uncomfortable. And therefore, even when the only way to get change sometimes, obviously, is to do that. So I sort of have, for me, been putting more sledgehammer songs in and also including more of the joyful, happy ones with them and hope people can make sense. I mean, I've seen videos of your group, and I just, again, that you have the comfort to just go hit them where it hits is something I need to, need to learn to be more comfortable upsetting people. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It makes perfect sense. Getting people to think about stuff. First of all, it's at the heart of all music that has meaning, to get people to think about stuff. Now the question is, do we get you less comfortable than where you've been? That is in all of the songs that were worthwhile in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and long before that as well. It's not that it started in the 60s. There's always been music that made people uncomfortable. The issue was, where are you going to go with it, right? Even the blues made people uncomfortable. Oh, yeah, it made white people uncomfortable in the beginning. And then they finally said, okay, we can get this. They didn't understand all the meanings, but they definitely got into the music, which meant that they were now more open generations later to understand more of the meanings. So
exactly.
It's an evolution, it's definitely an evolution.
And the other thing is taking myself seriously as a solo artist, and which could mean playing with other people too, but, doing my own music and also I thoroughly enjoy, as I think I've mentioned, I view my piano as my voice, and conveying emotion, conveying the message of whatever song I'm doing. My piano is an adjunct in doing it. It's not just an accompaniment. I sort of feel like I'm a duo, me and my piano, although we're one together. And doing my piano with other people as well, which is, going to places and enjoying, like I'm looking forward to playing with you. I'm probably going to be playing with a few other people and really seeing how we can enhance each other with that. And so those are the two things. And trying, if I get a rejection, to keep going. I really have difficulty taking that. It's like, oh, maybe I'm not good enough. Oh, look at him, he's doing this. Why do they need me? Mm-hmm. And yet my heart feels, there's something in my heart when I'm playing for people. And I like playing live, although I'm finally working on my first CD, which I'm thrilled about. I'm really thrilled. And a friend is help. We're recording it here, and then I'll have it mastered elsewhere. But I'm doing it in the house, and I'm doing a lot of learning, and he's helping me. But learning to, if not, I just know in here when I'm in playing music for people, and they're getting it in however way they want to get it, which mightn't even be the way I thought they'd get it, but they're getting it in some way. It's moving them to joy. It's moving them to think about empowering them. And a lot of my music, I'll take a personal story, like what would it take to realize my dream? And, what will it take to follow my heart? And then going, I wonder, I don't think I'm the only one who's tucked our dreams away. Could I inspire you to find yours too if I sing these words today? And trying to hit, to you, if I see someone becoming empowered, or someone say, now I'm going to do this, I've wanted to do it, or just have that look in their eyes, I feel most alive. I just feel, it's my calling. And
Amen.
I feel like I can describe it, and I feel like I've run away from it for too long and have to go, okay, if this is so important to me, how am I going to feel if I never go for it?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Wow. What a great story, and what a perfect way to close out our interview. But I do want to ask you, is there anything else you wanted to share that I haven't touched on, or that we should be aware of? I know that you don't have a website yet. Is that correct?
That's correct. And that's on my to-do list.
Okay. So that means you don't have other social media, or is there other social media we should know about?
I've gotten email, and if someone wants to email me their info at this moment, and I will let you know when my CD comes out and let you know when my website comes out. That will help me be, if I see more of that, that will assist me in being more accountable, because yes, the website's coming and I need to figure out how to do it in a good way that's, that shares what I can share with people without feeling like I'm being a snot about it. But it's definitely on the, it's definitely on the thing. So my email that you can reach me at is bdyskant@gmail.com. And the other thing is that to share is that those of us out in the country have issues too. I mean, we have issues with pipelines and dumps and things like that. And that there's a lot of good stuff happening out there, even in spite of the county may have gone for Trump, but that's not all of us. And we fought off a big landfill. We fought off a radioactive dump. We fought off something working along with the Seneca Nation. We fought off a horrible frack pollution thing. And that we're working with you. That's the one thing I want to leave you with. And the other thing is, I hope everyone listens to this who, acts on what they need to act on and still finds time to celebrate life. That's sort of what I want to lead, is what I feel like I'm about. Does that make sense to you?
It makes total sense, and it is an honor and a pleasure to share that vibe, that energy, that commitment, that purpose with you. So I'm going to say thank you very much, Barbara, for this time, and we will be hoping that we have a wonderful show and a full house as well.
Well, thank you, Chris. This has been a lovely time with this interview. Thank you for doing it, and I hope you have a gorgeous day.